Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome back to another episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Today, I'm not going to lie, and my guest is quite humble, so I'm going to embarrass him for a second. But he was one of my original OG guests that I wanted to have on this podcast. I met David, I guess it's coming on 8 years ago, at an AEIC event, and the engagement and how we communicated and what we were sharing in that room kind of inspired me that there are things that should be heard and stories to be told. And David, your voice was one of them. So I'm really excited to have you here to kind of talk about, your journey and some of your great work that you're doing at your company. And then really specifically, we're going to talk about the dynamic line rating projects that you're all moving forward and experiencing and looking forward to share with the industry. So with that, I'm going to give you an opportunity to introduce yourselves, and we'll go from there.
Well, thanks, Liz. And it's an honor to be invited to this, and I appreciate the kind words. And I think in an industry, the more that we share with each other, the better that we all do for our customers, for our employees, and all stakeholders. So thanks, and I'll be as transparent as I can be for the questions. So I'm responsible for operations in Pennsylvania, transmission and distribution. I'm also responsible for our transmission system for the state of Rhode Island. And I also lead our competitive transmission efforts, which are pretty much national. I have an engineering background. And so I kind of come in with that, say, context sometimes of things, but I probably have had more fun on the operations side, and I consider myself, operationally focused. I think it's very important that theory makes it to where it can make an impact. And so we've had initiatives over the years at PPL that I've been grateful to be a part of that we feel like made a difference for our customers. And I love sharing that.
And just for our listeners, just to set up the questions, you and I were on a parallel path. We were at the Distributed Energy Resource Subcommittee of AEIC back in 2017. So we're really talking about, the needs of the distribution grid, full situational awareness, understanding, how the grid can be managed with the future that was coming full force towards us in regards to the dynamic customer load changes. And so we were both also in the state of Pennsylvania, which was, thinking at the time solar was a word only the West thought of. So I just think it was interesting. And then our worlds collided again because my role at the utility in Western PA was I was saying, well, we can also think of the system as we are thinking of the distribution, aka the transmission grid. Do we have full situational awareness? And is there technologies, capabilities, new ways of thinking that could unlock information that we do not have? And so at the same time of trying to explore this new technology, dynamic line sensors, and bringing that to my company, you were actively doing that on your side and your role. So it was, we had a lot of shared impact. So that's really what I want to talk about, is really kind of where it all started. You're operating the grid, you're leading the group. How did and why did, I guess, dynamic line rating came into your world? If you could take us back.
Yeah, sure. I think maybe like if I kind of back up and if we go back, say 10 years when like smart grid was a very strong buzzword and a lot of different companies were pursuing that. And I feel like we all had different definitions of what smart grid meant. It became really apparent that at least within our company, we were somewhat disjointed. You have standards groups of engineers and they're speccing different types of reclosers and sensors and monitors. And then you have operations that's trying to operate the system based off of what is being built on it. And it's hard when we looked at it across the groups, it became kind of difficult to figure out how to pull together strategically to align all of our groups. Because when you look at something as overarching as, say, smart grid, if everyone's not towing in the same direction, they start to pull against each other. And so we started to arrive at kind of some foundational mindsets about how to achieve it. And still till now, we somewhat follow this mindset. we established that operational software is going to be like our brain. So we adopted a centralized philosophy. So our DMS and EMS systems, we view that as our brain. So any initiatives with those systems, the goal was to make the brain smarter. So at that time, it was kind of simple and early automation like Flizzr, things like Volt-VAR automation. Then, as you mentioned, Liz, with DER and distributed energy resources, then it became DERMS. Now it's about AI and trying to figure that out. But it was that we have a centralized philosophy, op systems of the brain. Then every smart grid device that we hung in the field, including dynamic line ratings now, is like a nerve feeding data back into that brain. And that was how we viewed it. So if a standards engineer, for instance, was going to spec a piece of equipment that was decentralized, maybe equipment talking to each other into the field instead of back to, say, the quote unquote brain, that verged from the strategy. So that was a no. And so when we kept like these simple kind of paradigms that we united behind, it kept all of the groups, engineering, operations, IT, aligned to achieve that same vision. And once that was clicking, then whatever comes with new technology, which is really exciting, there's always new technologies that kind of come to the fore. It always fit back into that, frame of mind. And so dynamic line ratings for us, we had programs to monitor and sensor. Our goal was to have data coming back from every major piece of equipment on the grid, every asset. There was never one for conductors. We have transformer monitors, we have CCVT monitors, we have circuit breaker monitors, and we can go down that list. Like in Pennsylvania, our transmission system is 100% monitored. Every major asset has a monitor. We can drive down maintenance and save costs for customers, and it improves reliability. Dynamic line ratings for us was just another monitor for the conductor. But the side benefit of dynamic line ratings, different than the others, was it can also reduce and alleviate congestion on the grid, which saves customers money in congestion costs on the supply side. And so we really put a focus on that as kind of like its own special niche.
Right. And I think, and just kind of sharing, undergoing the project of, for me, working within a utility, like I learned so much on the importance of being able to take something very complex and boiling it down to very simple, digestible statements of work, right? And purpose. And they, as you said, it had to be grounded in that unified understanding that that's where you're all headed. So like your simple idea that every asset needs to be monitored and visibly understood, especially now it's becoming more available with all the new technologies. And so, I recall, my step into wanting or desiring or thinking outside the box of dynamic line rating. It wasn't what the whole industry was talking about. It's like decongest. Is that even a word? The queue, unlock the queue. It was, there's all of these other talking points that those outside of the industry were pushing inside the industry, where what I saw and you kind of spoke to was this mountain of aha moments if we could just access the information, and it would change all of these various processes that no one else really understands unless you're in it real time trying to manage the grid. So what I latched onto is like you were effectively championing the same phenomena, but you had a clutch piece in regards to your first use cases or your first implementation of this was a congestion phenomena that the outside external audience kind of understood, right? So it was like a very synergistic moment. But I don't think, how do we get through? We don't need all these synergistic moments. We just need to have like the utilities need the data, and how we utilize the data will like expand. Anyway, so I love like just from, it comes back to storytelling, simplifying the problem, and just straight up, here is the execution plan. So there's always, we do a great job as a society putting on paper. So I also thought was really fascinating is that you went right into execution mode. And what that meant is you determined you're going to put these sensors on the line, and then you're going to operationalize the data. So I guess that's kind of crux. hooks to like all of the other utilities maybe like following suit is, achieving that. So I guess from your vision to roadmap, you had the idea, you decided to do it, you put them in, and, I heard how you prioritized it, but like, what was that journey like? And what did it take? Because it can't just be the utility, right? We work in a big world of many stakeholders. Can you talk about that a little bit of like, what were the anchors that really kept all of the stakeholders, not just the internal stakeholders, aligned?
Yeah, sure. And you're right, Liz. Like there was so many points of fear with dynamic line rating. Things like how are you going to comply with the NERC standards, like specifically FACO 08? What about cybersecurity concerns? Like you're going to be operating off of a rating that may have security issues, or how are you going to balance all of these different dynamic line ratings from an operational perspective? Is it going to influence how you plan the system? So there was kind of like all these question marks that were out there. I think when we first looked at it, kind of like in an innocent way, dynamic line ratings at sensors compared to other sensors are extremely simple. Like there are relays now that sample the system at 1 megahertz, like a million times a second. Dynamic line rating sends back a few variables like wind speed, ambient temperature, conductor temperature. Ours does vibration of the line to indirectly measure sag. It sends it back. It gives a rating once every 5 minutes. Comparatively, that's actually slow. And so when it came to ingesting that data, it's just like any other SCADA device that we have in our system. Like, as mentioned, there's a whole host of different monitors and sensors that send back data. This was just another one. And so when we kind of listed each of the different obstacles to making it happen, we were able to arrive at an answer for each of them. Like even take compliance. We went through the NERC standards. We listed, it was like 5 to 10 NERC standards that dynamic line ratings could apply to. FATCO 08 is number one, but there were a few others that it kind of like could touch on it. We called up reliability first. We asked for an assist visit specific to this. They were fantastic. They sat with us. We kind of showed them what we were going to do. We showed them where in our interpretation of the NERC standards, where, if we were audited, we might not have, say, the data that the standard requires, or might be different. And we just worked through it with them. Like how you had mentioned, like operationalizing the data, that became apparent very quickly too, of like getting a few bits of data every 5 minutes. That's easy for any utility, but plugging it into the day ahead market is a much different undertaking. And PJM worked as a great partner with us to make that happen. We had stand-up calls every Monday. And it was ironic because it started with like operations people with PPL and PJM. And it actually morphed into like IT people and IT people, because very quickly it became about like the secure link between our operational systems and theirs, and like to create a new API. Basically, we were kind of sending over static ratings to PJM up until that point. So we had to create like a continuous bridge between us. We're now up to over 10 lines that are like our larger transmission lines on our system that are now operationalized. Now we just, as soon as we hang the sensors, we work with PJM to operationalize it. So it's kind of like once the path is paved, it just kind of keeps going.
So there's so many. So for any of my avid listeners out there that kind of have been along for the journey and heard a lot of the threading that I've working to do, I just have to plug a few moments. And then for anyone that's new to the listening, we're saying SCADA, this idea that we are monitoring every device, and, just a moment of clarity. So, and I also had this moment of clarity. Like you also said, you lined up all the obstacles, and you just, as an organization, as a leadership group, as individual contributors, you all understood, okay, these are our said obstacles, and we are going to champion and move through each one in a unified, aligned manner. Now, I know I'm painting a beautiful picture, and it was probably a lot harder than I'm saying. However, I think those are key points for listeners to think, like, how are utilities like transforming the ways they think or the ways they operate? And I will say, it wasn't until I decided, so I was the leader of the transmission planning realm, and I was in charge of those compliance standards. And I got myself into the whole rating methodologies of conductors. And I was like, wait a second, what are we doing? This is very static data. And I remember 10 years prior being in ERCOT and the Texas utilities were talking about this technology. And so all the worlds came to be. And then I met, various technology vendors and yada, yada, yada. And what I ran into was a significant amount of pushback from almost every entity within the utility. And so at that moment in time, I literally changed my quote of my signature to say, obstacles do not block the path, they are the path. So I just have to plug that. And it's still been a part of my signature ever since. And that's very intuitive and connected. But what I realized is to move a new way of thinking through any organization requires an enormous amount of different skill sets. And no one talks about it. So this is why I'm excited to talk about it. Because what you had to do is work through all of those groups that you just mentioned, David, very quickly. But that takes resources, time, and dedication. And then when you collaborated with PJM, that was a phone call conversation. And we're doing this, let's circle the wagons. And then you started executing. Those are very simple ideas, but I think there's a lot, of us as society that gets in the way. But when it comes back to it, it's identifying the problem or seeking many solutions, weighing them, executing them, and then seeing the value. So operationalizing is a big aha moment, I think, for the industry as a whole, because there's a lot of fear. And so I was wondering, if you think about it for our new listeners, what we're saying around DLR is that there's moments in time where we're running simulations in the background every 4 minutes. We receive data from all of our telemetry and our SCADA. It compiles a power flow solution and it says, okay, this will converge, and therefore the grid is stable. And so we've been doing that since the 1970s into the 80s, when computers became available. We started scaling out more of our assets, and we're running this solution in near real time. And so what we did really from the 70s and 80s and 90s, the methodology was based on static wind and temperature, just to simplify this conversation because we don't have all day. And so what you're saying is you're sending a few points into the EMS system, which is that computational large power flow solution that not only is PPL running in their ops center, PJM, the operations center, is also, and there's that, and that's a whole world in itself. And then you more or less want to ensure that your solutions are the same every 4 minutes.
Yep. And you can take different approaches to it. So you can have even the vendor cloud host the algorithm that determines the rating, or you can take the data in raw and do it yourself in your own operational system. Most of the operational companies have a DLR type module. In working with PJM, one learnings for us there was PJM was really clever at determining okay, yes, you're going to give us a rating, but even when you extrapolate it out, what if there's a gust of wind that really, flies the rating one way or another, or what if it becomes erratic, or there's a loss of communication. So when it comes to those different things, there was kind of some conservative, I'll say smoothing algorithms put in that just kind of protected the system from being, just jerked back and forth depending on what was going on with especially wind, because wind change is obviously much more erratic than temperature. But as complicated as you might think that was, it ended up being pretty straightforward of how to fix that. And even the vendors, my observation of dynamic line ratings vendors is they're all learning too as we have it on the system. And so we're all kind of getting smarter with it now that there's actual use cases.
And I will say, another, as humans, and especially how the power grid evolved, vendors and AK, the utilities that were developing the grid, were actually the ones designing and implementing and installing these pieces of equipment. And so we're now in a world where we have to come to the table realizing that those that are developing the hardware and the systems that the utilities want to use, it's a partnership. And both parties will be learning. And I think one of my previous guests, he, told a story about the utilities are like penguins. They all go to the edge of the ice and they stare into the deep abyss, and no one jumps in because they're afraid the sea lions will eat them. So it only takes one, we'll call him Fred, PPL, I'm just kidding, to jump in. And if they don't notice any sea lions attacking them, everyone else joins. And so there's a big share here in regards to, you identify the obstacles, you champion them, you identify the complexities and like the challenges. And I think a couple others that I learned is, there's this idea is if you're going to open up your wires, you don't really literally, but you say that they can push more electrons than you typically been running it for decades or even a, certain period of time. There may be stress on, say, the towers and or other assets that flow may impact. And I guess you guys went through that journey as well, where you physically assessed the towers and your, engineering of thereof. And I remember you sharing it at, or was that EPA? No, Pennsylvania. Oh my gosh, come on, hurry up, say it. So that organization that where all
Association.
the Pennsylvania
Yeah.
stuff. Yes. Sorry, Energy Association. But you guys shared that great story. And that was a huge share, I think, for a lot of people in the room is like, you know, everyone's voice matters, everyone's concern matters, but we have to create space where all of those moments of did we think about this has that time and champion to clear it. It's not a moment to just shut down the project. That's kind of what I'm saying, right? You just have to keep moving forward. Love it. So you guys started, I think, you can call it, I think, 2 lines or whatnot, and you said now you're getting over 10. So is there a process or just like an ideology or methodology in regards to how you're determining and planning the rollout, or is it just something, you know, can you speak to that journey?
Yeah, sure. I mean, basically, it's like transmission infrastructure is needed, but it's very expensive. And to balance that cost side of it and affordability for customers, our mindset is if there's congestion on a line, or if we think there will be future congestion on a line, the first tool in our toolbox that we grab for is dynamic line ratings, because the cost benefit isn't even close. Like you mentioned, Liz, our first 2 installations, one of them, the dynamic line rating sensors were about $250,000. It eliminated the need for a $50 million rebuild. The line was the Harvard Susquehanna line, to be specific. And so if dynamic line ratings works, it's a no-brainer. And we would never want to try to justify a high spend project when a cheap sensor will do the job. And so that is how we arrive at it, is lines that we think will have congestion. We will place dynamic line ratings on them. And if it alleviates the congestion, then we move on. If it doesn't, then we know we need a project. But then we also feel like now we have a justified, stronger basis for the project too. And so that's basically been our approach. I'd probably sprinkle that on with even though the biggest benefit from dynamic line ratings is to alleviate congestion because of the customer cost savings, it really is an asset health tool too. And so if we have lines that are approaching, 50, 60, 70 years old, and we want some data back on the conductor health, dynamic line ratings is a good tool to understand what conditions that conductor has been living under. High heat, low wind, and then we compare it with other data, how many faults it's seen, things like that, to determine and give us confidence on whether it should be replaced or not.
And so, to our listeners, I'm speaking to you all, but the goal of the Grid Mod Pod has always been to create a space where we're educating, informing, and sharing really inspirational, but also projects or efforts that are happening within the utility space. And I guess going back to our DER days, what I found fascinating is going into the room. There was 40. I think it was a highly attended meeting in San Francisco. PG&E hosted us. And Hawaii, Arizona, California was in the room talking about how to manage this dynamic load. And at that point, 8 years ago, the idea of all utilities having distribution grid models that are even modeled, let alone have all of this enormous data being ingested and then sharing, day ahead forecasts was almost incomprehensible. And that was only 8 years ago. And so a lot of the West utilities that were now dealing with it and having to think creatively after the fact, I'm going to give you a shout out. I remember you stood up, I didn't know who you were, and you were so adamant on, okay, now that we know that these devices potentially could have all this detrimental impact on the performance of our grid and our assets, shouldn't we get ahead of the curve? And I think you were speaking to like the East Coast utilities that were sitting there in regards to, at that time, you didn't fully have the answer baked or understand the next step, but you had this passion in your voice that sounded strong and the conviction was real, is that, well, let's go figure it out, right? So, I think the journey that we just shared here was that same type of energy of like, okay, we know that we have congestion. We know we are up against an enormous amount of, and at the time, actually, we didn't have this load growth epidemic that we're going through right now, but we knew that we had an enormous amount of aged assets, and we had this world where generation was retiring as well as generation was being built, as well as it looking different. So those core ideas. So it was almost the same ideology showing up. I think, when you came to the table, it was like, okay, we know we need to be better informed. And so how do we gain this information in a cost affordable way that could then unlock, really, you didn't know at the time, an enormous amount of other insights and use cases, of which you just meant asset management. So all I have to say, full circle, is like showing up in a space of the unknown, but believing in the realities of what you know, and you came from working in the utility, right? Your origin background. You kind of put those dots together and then shared. So I'm answering a question I had for you, which is like, how did you get them to listen? Or how did you get the initiative? And I'm not saying it was all on you, but because I don't know what happened once you go back, but I just remember that conviction and that passion. It really inspired me to go back and be it wouldn't be opinionated. Like there was an enormous amount of knowledge being shared in all of these sparse industries as well as our own industry, but bringing that together and presenting it to all the various players and knowing that the story had to be slightly different was a craft. So I'm not sure if that's what you were doing, but I think storytelling and be able to communicate effectively of like why we're doing it. So that's a long-winded back end to say, what, looking back on your journey and really your space and where we are as an industry, like what are any nuggets of wisdom that you would give for the individual contributor that wants to make a difference, and or someone that's outside the industry that wants to partake, aka maybe a recent grad? What's a nugget of wisdom you'd want to share as you traverse this industry that we're in?
I genuinely believe that utilities, they want to do what's best for their customers. And it's a difficult business. It drives a very tactical approach. We restore customers in storms. We're dealing with daily issues. We have a lot of different stakeholders, and what that can cause is us to constantly look at what's next and surviving the next day and doing what's right for customers today and tomorrow. But every once in a while, we have to pop our head up, and we need to look out, and we need to devote time and energy and strategy into what things will look like, not just talking about them, not just a buzzword. Like AI right now to me is a buzzword, but it's going to become real. It's going to be integrated in the guts of our business. So yes, it's important to be tactical and to deliver every day for customers, but it's really important to put our heads up too and just say, what does next year look like? What does 3 years look like? 5 years, 10 years? And there'll be curveballs along that way that we'll need to adapt to, but it's important to look out. I think what I'd say too is, if for an individual contributor in whatever organization or whatever group, utilities, we all have our strengths and weaknesses. Like maybe PPL does dynamic line ratings very well, but we don't do VoltVar so well. I'll tell you, I'm learning from peers on VoltVar optimization and better ways of doing things that we are well behind on, I feel like. And it's important to be honest with those things, because when you can recognize what your company doesn't do well and another company does, and you share with each other, that's one of the beautiful things about our industry is we're not really competitors, especially not in distribution. And so it helps to share with each other. And so, I've met great people in my career, including yourself, Liz, that have really made an impact on myself. And I hope that that's been mutual. I think I'd give that advice to someone coming into this industry is benchmark, learn. Don't feel like you do it the best way and everyone else is always just trying to catch up. It's like, no, there's certain things you do good and there's other things that you can learn from others on. And I think that's important to it drives continuous learning if we all have that viewpoint.
One of my favorite words, we all must be continuous learners. And we should teach that to all our children. It doesn't end at the end of your school day. And yeah, so I think, there's an enormous shift happening, right? And it's a mindset shift. That's another thing I love. But it's really letting go of what was, right? And embracing this like emerging technologies. And I feel like at this point in time, with everything happening, we might be like shouting into like the echoes. But the system, the expectations, the tools that shaped the grid that we now have were completely designed for a different pace, a different set of technologies, and a different level of varying complexities. So like, we can't say that enough. And so I just want to say that it's a beautiful story of how we did rating methodology of the conductor and we thought outside the box. And that ripple effect touches many business units within a utility and many external entities. And so if there's a lesson to be shared, here's exactly what you just shared for our next incoming. But I think it's also an invaluable lesson for all the parties that are looking to the utility to be the one that can solve all of this exponential load growth, as well as, managing the aged infrastructure, as well as maintaining the affordability of the grid. There is a mindset shift that is occurring with the humans, right? With the people. And that takes time, but it also takes, aligned leadership and really an executable plan. So I love that you came and shared it with us today. I think your work proves that progress isn't just about technology. It's clarity of purpose and getting it done. So I want to thank you for showing up, sharing it, and I look forward to our continued work in this industry as we move through these dynamic times.
That goes both ways. Thanks, Liz.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.